Let's talk about pollution in stormwater runoff and how we can protect our watersheds. First of all, why is water important? Earth is referred to as the blue planet because so much of its surface is covered in water, and all this water is important to life on Earth. Safe, clean water is essential to our lives and the lives of the plants and animals we share this planet with. Water is inherently and culturally valuable. We rely on it for drinking and fishing, as well as recreational activities like swimming, boating, kayaking, and birding. It is also important for shipping and industry. It's not just people that depend on clean water. It is also essential to the lives of the plants and animals we share this planet with. Here are just a few examples of animals big and small from our region. There's mammals like the muskrat, birds like the great blue heron and mallards with their young ducklings, reptiles like the endangered spiny softshell turtle and eastern fox snake, amphibians like the American toad and mud puppy salamander, as well as insects like the dragonfly, and so many others that support this complex food web. There are a lot of amazing and even globally rare animals living in the streams and rivers in our region that are studied by our biologists at the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, as well as other organizations. We've gone over some of the reasons water is important. Now let's talk about where it is found on Earth. Even though water covers 71% of the Earth's surface, if we gathered it all up into a ball, this is what all the water on Earth would look like. It doesn't look like nearly as much when it's not spread out across the planet. Of all the water on Earth, the vast majority, 97%, is found in the oceans. Only a small amount, just 3%, is freshwater. Most of the world's freshwater is frozen in ice caps or glaciers. This second smallest ball is all of the world's liquid freshwater, a large portion of which is deep underground. And this tiny speck is all the freshwater found in lakes and rivers across Earth. This relatively small amount of accessible freshwater is an important source of drinking water for people across the planet. Now let's talk about how this water moves on Earth. Let's start by recalling the water cycle. Heat from the sun powers this cycle. It causes water to evaporate, which condenses into clouds when it reaches the cold air high up in the atmosphere. Water droplets from these clouds then fall back down to Earth as precipitation, like rain or snow. Some of the water that lands on the ground soaks into the earth, where it can be taken up by plants to help them grow. It can also move, or infiltrate, very deep into the ground and help recharge aquifers. If the ground is frozen or already full of water, the rain or snow can't soak into the ground, so it washes across it. This is called surface runoff and is what we're going to be focusing on. Watersheds play a big role in how surface runoff moves. Let's learn what a watershed is.
A watershed is an area of land where surface water drains down to a single point, be it a stream, lake, or ocean. A watershed, also called a drainage basin, collects all of the water that doesn't first get evaporated or transpired, whether it's from rain, snow and ice melt, sprinklers, spilt slushies, or even... Oh, yes, my old nemesis, water balloons. It's like a big funnel that drains down to one spot. The area of a watershed is defined by topography, the shape of the land. Its borders are marked by the drainage divide, the highest ridge that divides the water from falling into its own basin rather than that of another. To visualize it better, let's take a look at this roof and its gutters. The rain that falls on each side ends up draining into its own gutter. The drainage divide is marked by the peaks of the roof, and each section could be considered a watershed. The area of a watershed is also defined by what common source of water it flows into. Jennifer lives in a watershed that flows into a nearby stream. That watershed, along with neighboring watersheds, make up an even bigger watershed, made up of other neighboring watersheds that make up an even bigger watershed.
As that video explained, watersheds can be looked at different scales. If we zoom out to the North American continent, you can see that it can be divided into very large-scale watersheds. The Rocky Mountains are a good example of a drainage divide, which basically form a big ridge across the continent where water that falls on the west side of the mountain range flows into the Pacific Ocean, and water that falls on the east side ultimately drains north to the Arctic Ocean, northeast to Hudson Bay, east to the Atlantic Ocean, or southwest to the Gulf of Mexico. If we look a little closer to home, this blue area is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence drainage basin. It is part of the continent that drains to the Atlantic Ocean. It can be further divided into the 5 drainage areas for each of the Great Lakes. Let's take a closer look. Water in the Great Lakes moves like a very slow-moving river. Water from Lake Superior and Lake Michigan move into Lake Huron. Water from Lake Huron goes down the St. Clair River, through Lake St. Clair and the Detroit River to Lake Erie. Water from Lake Erie goes over Niagara Falls to Lake Ontario. And finally, water from Lake Ontario travels down the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. Now let's take a closer look at the Lake Erie watershed. Finally, here's the watershed that we live in, the Sydenham Watershed. Here are many of the municipalities and communities in the Sydenham Watershed. Do you see where you live on the map? This is the East Sydenham. Water flows southwest from Coldstream, Strathroy, and Watford down through Alvinston, Florence, Don Mills, and Dresden to Wallaceburg. This is the North Sydenham Watershed. Water flows southwest from Warwick and Wyoming through Petrolia, Brigden, and Wilkesport, west from Oil City and Oil Springs, south down to Wallaceburg. These are 2 smaller drainage areas in the Sydenham watershed that flow west. The St. Clair River tributaries flow west from Point Edward, Sarnia, Aamjiwnaang, Corunna, Moortown, Courtright, Sombra, Port Lambton, to the St. Clair River past Bacquejwaneng and Wallaceburg down to Lake St. Clair. The Lake St. Clair tributaries flow west from Dover Center and Mitchell's Bay to Lake St. Clair. Water that falls on the land in the Sydenham watershed ends up in Lake St. Clair. From Lake St. Clair, the water travels down the Detroit River to Lake Erie. So even though we don't live on the shores of Lake Erie and can't see it from our homes, the water from our land, drains, and rivers in the Sydenham watershed ends up in this lake and has an impact on its water. We live in a very special area here in the Sydenham watershed and larger Great Lakes region. About 1/4 of all the water found in lakes and rivers across Earth is in the Great Lakes. Because it is such a special place, a lot of people live around these lakes. This is a nighttime view of the Great Lakes from space. We can see all the lights from the homes and cities in the region, which helps give us a better idea of where all the people live. You can see that the area around Lake Superior is pretty dark, whereas there's lots of lights around Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. In total, about 34 million people live in the Great Lakes Basin, a third of which live around Lake Erie. Each one of us that lives in the Great Lakes watershed has an impact on the water in these lakes, and the actions of 34 million people add up. That's why it's so important that we all do our part to keep pollution from around our homes, farms, cities, and streets out of local drains, ditches, rivers, and lakes, for the health of these water bodies as well as the health of the water bodies downstream of us. When it rains or snows, the water that hits our roofs goes down the gutters and makes its way across the land. Some of the water that falls on the ground will soak in or be taken up by plants, but the remainder will continue on as runoff. Water that hits paved surfaces, like driveways, streets, and sidewalks, can't soak into the earth, so more and more water ends up flowing across the land. As all this runoff moves across the land, it picks up pollution that it carries to storm drains. This polluted stormwater doesn't get treated. It goes down the storm drains, through underground pipes, and is released directly to local lakes and rivers, where it can harm the plants and animals living downstream, as well as people using these water bodies to swim, fish, and drink. These are some of the sources of pollution and runoff: pesticides and fertilizers, uncovered soil, yard and pet waste, litter, detergents from washing cars and driveways, oil or other household chemicals that get spilled or dumped, and road salts. The types of pollution and runoff around your home are the same types of pollution in cities and rural or agricultural areas, just at different scales, so the same principles apply. One impact of pollution from stormwater runoff are algae blooms. Algae are a normal part of healthy freshwater environments, but in the same way that nutrients from fertilizers can help your grass, garden, or crops grow, they can also make algae grow very quickly in water, forming these blooms, which causes a lot of problems. Here are some examples of different types of algae blooms we've seen locally in the Sydenham Watershed. And here's another example. Our biologists were out studying the fish and other wildlife living in this watercourse, but were surprised by the amount of algae they caught in their net as well. You can see just how full and heavy their net was with algae. Here are just some of the animals that were living in this watercourse being impacted by this algal bloom. A pumpkin seed sunfish, a black bullhead catfish, a midland painted turtle, and a bullfrog, among many others. Not only do algal blooms occur locally, the excess nutrients from the Sydenham and other surrounding watersheds impact the water quality further downstream in Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. These pictures show just how big these algal blooms can get. These massive swirls of green are so big that they can be seen from space. Algal blooms cause a lot of problems. They can be toxic, making the water unsafe for wildlife, pets, and people to swim in or drink. And as the blooms decompose, they use up oxygen in the water that fish and other animals need to breathe. Here's a closer look at some of these algal blooms in the Lake Erie Basin. Not only are they a health and safety concern, they prevent people from accessing the water and hurt local economies that rely on tourism and commercial fisheries. These algal blooms are just one example of why it is so important that we don't allow pollution to get washed off the land and make sure only rain goes down the drain. So how can we keep pollution from runoff out of watercourses? Let's go through some examples. When doing yard work, we can clean up any litter and put it in the garbage. We can also tidy up and compost yard waste that we can then add back to our soil to make it healthier. We can also stop our soil from being washed away by keeping it covered with ground-covering plants and mulch. It's also important to clean up after our pets, as their waste can be a source of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. We can prevent detergents from going down storm drains by using commercial car washes which collect and treat the wash water. Or we can wash our cars on grass or gravel so that the dirty water has a chance to soak into the ground, versus running straight down the driveway, through drains, and into lakes and rivers. When using oil and other chemicals, it's best to prevent and clean up any spills. Any leftover chemicals should be taken to hazardous household waste drop-off centers to be safely and properly disposed of. They should not be dumped down storm drains, or any sinks or drains in your house. Fertilizers, pesticides, road salts, and other chemicals should only be used when they are needed and sparingly, and definitely not right before a storm when they'll be immediately washed away. There are also things that can be done around homes, businesses, and municipalities to reduce the amount of surface runoff, slow it down, and help it soak into the ground. Not only does this help prevent pollution from ending up in nearby streams, it reduces flooding and helps conserve water. One way of reducing the amount of runoff in the first place is by reducing paved surfaces. For example, instead of installing a concrete path, paving stones can be used, which have gaps between them and allow water to soak into the ground. Another way of reducing runoff is by creating a rain garden, which collects runoff and has the added benefit of supporting beautiful, low-maintenance native plants. Installing a rain barrel at your downspouts is a relatively easy and inexpensive way of capturing rainwater, which can then be used to water your lawn and garden during dry periods. Here's a full list of some tips to prevent pollution and runoff and capture stormwater on the land where it can be used to help plants grow. You can also find other resources and learn more about the Sydenham Watershed and the amazing animals that live here by visiting sydenhamriver.on.ca. Thank you for helping to keep our watershed healthy.